So we went out last night, and I was overruled, and John and Jonathan decided that I'd been converted, and I would talk about BFO and not about BORO. But, I had a religious road to Damascus kind of experience, and in a sense, there's a serious note to this. I think almost John could have done, I reckon, to some extent, a BORO presentation. I think I could do some of a BFO, maybe not as well as John, and I think we could slide around. So it's an indication of a maturity, I think, of our community, that we're beginning to see how the other participants in the community are working and being able to do it. And I think one of the things that's been nice about the summer school is that I've noticed, certainly as we, the presenters have been talking, and also as you go among you, is that people are beginning to see the connections between the various different options, if you like, for a top ontology. This is the the session today. Apparently it's not quite like this. I'm hoping I normally have 100 slides for every hour, and I talk fast enough such that there's time for questions at the end. I'll try not to talk too fast. I do have a lot of slides. Part of the reason is that a lot of the slides will have references, and I'm hoping that if something interests you, you can go back to the slide pack, find the reference, and look it up. Because I don't think you're not, a lot of the ideas, the interesting ideas, it's unlikely that I'm going to be able to communicate them properly or well in the few seconds or minutes that I have it. And so they're just pointers to further work if it interests you. I don't expect you to be interested by everything. It'd be nice if you're interested by a few things. Let's just see what happens. So we're going to have 2 breaks, maybe not 9:45, it might be 9:55 with a short break, a longer break at 10:45, and then a pretty hard stop at 12. I think Salvatore will come over and drag me off the stage, and then we have the standard afternoon sessions. As with all the other sessions, I'm happy to take questions. The only thing I would say is that because I've got so many slides, if I have to make an instantaneous judgment, which is unlikely to be a good judgment because it's instantaneous, about whether to continue with the slides because I need to finish them, or whether to deal with your questions. So I apologize in advance if I push your question to the end or the break. What else have I got on here? I don't know my slide pack. I have, what I've tried to do is that, because there are so many slides, I've marked just to remind me, if you've got a purple color on a slide, that's a slide which, if you read quickly, you can see. If you don't read quickly, you can get it when you can read it when you get the actual hard copy of the pack. Right, so I did my thing in a series of, let's see, do I need to do escape? Which one is one? Okay, hopefully this is the first one. Okay. I think it's amusing. I think you normally find people who talk about technology and pretend to be experts on technology aren't actually very good at using it. I think there's a good inverse correlation. I don't know whether that means you're actually your opinions on technology are worthwhile if you can't use it, or whether it means your opinions on technology probably aren't worthwhile. Let's see. Okay, so the structure that I've got is I've divided. I was trying to work out beforehand what I needed to explain to you, because if we haven't got much time, so what's important. And I've decided to break it down into 3. I think Sal sent out, or Sal and Gwenda sent out this top-level survey, which is work that we did. I did with Pierre. I don't know whether Sal were you. I don't know whether you might have been involved. I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago. And what it was trying to do was trying to find a way of being able to look across and compare and look at the similarities and the differences across the various top ontologies. And in this context thing, I'm trying to using that as a basis, give you some understanding of or a format or a context for the next session, which is the BORO ontology. So I think, if you like, we've taken different approaches, different routes to explaining over the days the different ontologies. And what I want to do is, like, if you like, step back, doing a meta-ontological exercise of saying, what's the framing? And I think I need to do it because I think I've got a different framing from well, actually, John and I are getting closer, and I'm trying to, where's Stefano gone? As I'm trying to persuade Stefano with limited success that my particular approach or the particular context that I want to put it in is a good context. So I'll spend the middle session just going over the ontology, and then we'll go over the analysis tools. And part of the motivation for that is I think that ontology, or the kind of ontology that I do, is a practice rather than a theory. And so the examples are a good time where you can actually practice the practice. And in order to be able to practice the practice well, you need to be able to understand what you're practicing. So we'll spend the third session going through that. Let me see here. I'm going to briefly try and give an overall picture of what's going on, and then I've tried to break down the context into three levels. Just a question about what an ontology is, or why ontologies. Then look at foundational ontologies from two levels: the purpose and their nature. I need to try and remember what I had on my slide. So I think it's a theme. I remember Nicola goes strong on this. Is that we're actually doing ontological engineering rather than ontology. And engineering can be seen as being driven as a practice. It starts as a practice, and the theory emerges from the practice. And I think that's for me at least, personally, that was a good way to understand the way ontological engineering works. And I think particularly foundational ontology engineering is that it's a practice, and what's the practice and what theory emerges from the practice. I thought a way of framing it is that is in terms of questions, and the questions are sort of why bother questions, what's the point questions, and that's the first two for ontologies and foundational ontologies. And then we talk about foundational ontologies, but what kind of thing are they? And I think that what I'd like to do is provide a kind of a framework, a context for what's going on, and then within this context explain to you how BORO deals with these particular contexts that we've gone through. So if you go through the literature and you talk to people, if you like, for the first discussion about why you should do ontologies, I think the standard answer is about improving interoperability. And if you go through the literature, it's pretty much the case. The original Gruber article that people point to in terms of the overall ontology space, which includes if you like, the IL-type ontologies and so forth, RDF ontologies and so forth, is that it's something to do with interoperability. And if you read Tom's paper, it's quite clear that they're having problems with interoperability, and they're trying to find a solution. He's trying to explain within his KR domain what's going on. If you look at the genealogy, or in fact the etymology rather than the genealogy, though the etymology release of genealogy is that about interoperability, what's interesting is that it appears in the 1960s. I was actually trying to find exactly where it appeared, and some of the things are behind paywalls and somewhere elsewhere, so they weren't exactly clear where it appeared. There was someone mentioned 1965. There was a mention, I think, in the Times newspaper, and there was some journal, and I think it was in Nature, mentioned it in 69. But the actual word didn't appear till then. There was a word that where they worried about machines talking to machines, which was compatibility, if you go to the 1920s with radios. But this talk of interoperability goes back to the 60s. And in the early days, there was a story. If you look at the marketing stories, again, I think they're revealing. They kept on talking about meanings, if you look at the early things. But later on, and it's particularly true in the military, they talk about capability. It's the capability. So what it is that if you start with one machine and you take the information one machine and you pass it to another, is that second machine capable of using that information to do something? So it's very much an operational definition. And I think that's because the problems they were trying to solve were operational. If you've got to work out what a meaning is, then define a meaning and then work out what to do with it, that's just too much work if you're running this. So it's really an operational issue. Under there, you've got some of the quotes that sort of indicate this change. Okay, one of the things about the data in 1965 that's interesting, well, maybe obvious, is that it seems to be some connection to computing. And if you talk, I'm trying to remember what's in the slides actually, so if you talk on, so if you go back and through and you look at what's going on, and you try and classify the types of interoperability that you might have, you could say, look, this machine to machine, machine to human, or human to human. And what was novel in 1965 is that computing was around, and you had this problem about machine-to-machine communication and human-to-machine communication. Human-to-human communication has been a problem for a long time, and I think I've got something on the next slide that talks about that. And so it seems to be that there's this underlying text that, and I've asked quite a few people when they think about interoperability and everything else, do they think it's machine-to-machine or something else? And everyone says, yes, it's about machines. This is, if you like, a diagram that we sometimes use to illustrate this division about what's going between what. And the big thing, if you look at the right-hand side, I probably shouldn't spend too much time on the purple slides, otherwise we won't have enough, is that there's no humans involved. And I think that's going to be a theme today, is when you're trying to work with these ontologies, can you create a situation where there's no humans involved? Because you want the machine to talk to the machine. This is the thing, the capability that you're trying to achieve. How do you set up the situation? I've talked about this before, and I was trying to think about what's the earliest case, and there's actually the Tower of Babel narrative. People talk about it. When you actually go back to the actual narrative, they say nothing that they propose to do now will now be impossible for them because they have interoperability. So this is like a slogan for interoperability. If you've got interoperability, you can do anything. The intriguing thing is that the story says they found interoperability and then God took it away. I think the problem is that we've got is that we haven't found interoperability and we'd like God to give it to us. I have a feeling that even though that, at least for academics applying for fundings and maybe for managers and businesses applying for fundings, is that there is a discussion about, well, that's not quite true. That I think there are some people, if you're in some bits of the business, interoperability is a real issue and you can feel it and it hurts. But in other cases, you're using it as an excuse to start your funding, and then you do some abstruse bit of logic that may be vaguely related, may actually be the secret that unlocks interoperability, but that the connection's not clear. So I think it's useful to spend a bit of time thinking about it. And one of the things that I'm looking back, when I was looking at it, when people explain the problems of interoperability, they're normally talking about a failure of interoperability. And the classic, which I presume most, if not all of you know, is the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, where they had this, went from imperial to metric. They had, I think they said that the landing speed needed to be 90, and it was specified by, I don't know which, around the US, which they assumed was miles per hour, and it came to Europe, and they coded it as kilometers an hour, and as you know, the orbiter smashed into the ground. So this was an example of a catastrophic result of a failure of interoperability. But the sad thing about that is that it's okay if you're trying to explain what the problem of interoperability is, in the sense of what happens when you don't have interoperability, but it's not actually the problem that I think that needs to be solved. And I think a better example is this notion of data lakes. So the problem is that it's not that there's something that you normally do and you have a failure. There's all sorts of things that you could do if you had interoperability. And some of you will undoubtedly be familiar with this notion of a data lake, where you put all your data into a big lake, and then because it's on the same machine, it's on the same disk, somehow you'll be able to access it and be able to do queries across the bits of data. And they're finding it doesn't work because the data's in different forms, so they then have to transform it to get into a form that's readable. And this expression data swamp has been coined for the data because it's just there and it's not doing anything, because you can't do anything with it because it doesn't interoperate. So if you're trying to say, if your story is that we don't have interoperability, if we had interoperability we could do things, the exploitation should be focusing on the gaps rather than the odd failure that you come across. And the gap might be not that you can't do it, but that it's too expensive. So it might be a cost reason for not doing it, a cost of curation, as it says here, rather than an actual feasibility issue. I think there's a problem in trying to measure it. I think people have come up with different kinds of measures, but as with all these things, they're not altogether convincing. They're a lot like stabs at trying to get at what's going there. One way that I find is really nice is what I've called a Coasian metric, and the idea is that what you're aiming for is interoperability across systems, should be in roughly the same sort of cost ballpark as interoperability in systems. However, with larger systems, because there's such a mess of cobble together systems that sometimes interoperability inside systems is not exactly a good indication of the kind of interoperability you want, but it gives you some kind of feel for what's going on. I doubt whether, well, if you've seen my presentations, maybe you've seen it before, but if you could go back to the 1980s, particularly into engineering, the engineering discipline, engineering lectures, you would likely to come across this slide. And they've got a metaphor of islands of automation, and the idea is that the height represents the age, so you can see 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and there were these islands emerging, islands of automation emerging from the sea, and what was happening, and I'm not sure I can see quite clearly without my glasses, that as the islands get closer and closer together, they build bridges. I mean, it seems sensible if these two systems in terms of business processes abut one another. It seems silly that some guy should read the system and then key exactly the same data into another system. Why doesn't the one system talk to another? If you then try and look at it as a more abstract, more schematic version, this is another picture. So what you see is what happens is as a system grows, the opportunities for them to interoperate arise because they become closer together. There's less the data that needs to go from one system to the other. The only problem is translation. There's no extra work that needs to be done, and you get more and more bridges. And as you get more and more automated, more and more of these opportunities for data exchange arise. So you could argue that they go from being islands of automation to continents of automation. If you actually do a 4D version of what's going on here, is that you can see that you get interoperability asynchronously as well as synchronously. So one of the things of the original picture, all you saw was a synchronous automation. So it's one machine talking to another machine at a point in time. But what happens with machines? Machines get replaced, and the data in the old system needs to get past the new system. And the difference between the two is that if you think about it, is that if you've got to pass all the information from one system to another, there's a much bigger burden of interoperability. There's a much bigger burden of data exchange that needs to be sorted out. No, fine, yes. Though I might ask you to leave it to the end if it's going to take too long. This one. No, sorry. This is 4D, just meaning I'm on my map. I'm trying to show it. It's not there's no ontology in this whatsoever. Yeah. I mean, ask the question. It might be really interesting, but that's not the intention. Yeah. Okay. I'm sure I shouldn't have said that. That would have been. I'm sure that would have been a really good question. Okay. I think the issue that I'm trying to make here is that. When you look carefully, you get more and more. If interoperability is about data exchange, you get more and more data exchange that people look at. And people often look at data exchange over APIs, and often small APIs. And the bigger things, they're just too much of a problem. They don't want to talk about it. And I'm just trying to say that this interoperability is pervasive. If you think about, particularly let's think about this asynchronous version, you're going from one system to another. If you've got to take all of one system to another system, as the system gets bigger and the type of data increases, the size of the task get higher. It's difficult to do. I tried to do some kind of estimation. I took a SAP ERP as an example, sort of a typical system, and I showed this to a colleague who works a lot with SAP, and he was saying that the figures are all wrong. They're an order of magnitude too low. I mean, there are various commands you can run, but the trouble is it's sensitive to a particular instance. So on the sites that he works, he might have a different machine. Who knows? I mean, does the size look good, do you think, or not? I know you work with systems. Does this seem unreasonable as a size for a system, or? Oh, no, I wasn't thinking Peter, the guy in front of you. Oh, it doesn't matter, okay. So then if you see you've got large systems, you get anecdotal evidence. There's not actually detailed evidence. I mean, there are papers that talk about it, but they're not good enough to be reliable. But there seems to be this idea that roughly every decade or so the system gets replaced. So you've got this enormous problem of this enormous data exchange. And it is a problem. It is when people working on it, there's a problem with interoperability. And this goes back to this issue about whether it's a capability gap or not is when you start looking at, if we go back to the metaphor, is that the bridges are really narrow. When you look at the APIs, there's not much data going across it. So the things where we're successful are not exchanging all of the data across something. It's a small bit of data, tightly controlled, small number of transactions that go across. So in terms of what we can do, what our technology is capable of doing now, it can't deal with large volumes of interoperability. I mean, we have successful interoperability, but it's not. It's only minor, not major. And this is a marker of missed opportunities. I think I'm going to have to speed up. So, sure. This one? It's interesting. So I work with I have a colleague, Ian Bailey, and he was saying something that I've come across. I think the problem is the other way, is we throw away stuff that we shouldn't. So I worked on I had a friend who was working on a project in Zurich, and we went to look at them, and they had an old system, but it was an old green screen system, and they got a burning platform. They're going to replace it with an app, and when we were looking at the functionality of the package that they were buying in, it was significantly less than the new system. So I think we've got this problem. And if you think of it from an evolutionary point of view, if these were species and they were reproducing, what you're doing is you're attenuating the capabilities of things. I mean, you're adding in some stuff. I mean, they had nice colored screens and they had pull downs, but the actual capability for doing the business processes was significantly less. So I think you're right. That's one problem. You keep all this data and people spend a fortune for doing it. But side by side, you're actually losing in terms of the systems. You've got less, not more functionality, but it looks prettier because it's got what sells, the prettiness stuff that sells. I don't have the data, but that's a personal impression on working on these systems. And I think there's a pressure as well, is that you've got to automate something, and you tend to be, with budget constraints, you tend to automate it suboptimally, and yeah. I think there's another theme that if I could persuade you to take away today, is this distinction between product, process, and end product. All of the talk. Okay, that's not fair. But if I could slightly exaggerate and sort of say something that isn't quite true. I think in the previous things there was very much a focus on the end product, on the ontology you produce, and less focus on the process of doing it. And I know, John's not going to interrupt. John's going to say that's not true, and he's right in the sense it wasn't true. It's only half true. So, but I think there is generally in the community, it would be fair to say, I think it's true. There's a focus very much on the end product, which is the ontology rather than the process. And I think that one of the things that you need to look at is the way in which you formalize. And if you're doing an ontologization, if you look at these other pictures about data going from one system to another, the process is the end product, because that's what you want to do. It's actually the ontology is a tool. Yeah, John's nodding. I'll take that as a yes. I'll take what I can. What's interesting is I'm a fan of Katerina's work. A friend of mine claims I have an intellectual crush on her because I talk about her so much. What I did at the time is that she's medieval logician, and she says if you go to medieval logic, when you look at medieval logic, there's as much interest on formalization as there is on the actual formal structure you end up with. For them, these are equal problems. And she said, it's her comment, not mine, she says in modern logic, there's a focus on the end product and not on the formalization. And I think that's equally true on the way in which data modeling works and the way in which some people in the ontology community work, and I think there's a balance that needs to be redressed. So I'm not saying I'm saying they're both needed. I'm not saying the process is everything, but it may actually turn out to be the case that the process is in some ways almost more important than the product. And I don't think that's what most people in the community think now. Let's see. Okay, so, and again, I think what I'm hoping to persuade you, and is that there is opportunities for deploying or using ontologies that are there for the taking if we can see them, and we're not seeing them in the right way. So we need to see firstly where the opportunities are, and in part and parcel of seeing where the opportunities are is seeing a way to exploit them. I wonder, okay, so I'm trying, what I'm going to do now, for people with a philosophical background, you will regard as a gross simplification. So hopefully it's not so gross that you think it's totally untrue. But I think what's nice for the simplification is it makes very clear what I think are the important constraints over it. So if you look at schematically, if we take this process, which is the asynchronous process of the two systems here, and the data is coming out, and then we move to a new system, and the new system takes over the responsibilities of the old systems. Schematically, you've got end nodes, and the data exchange migrates these data between the nodes, and because the data, the structure of the systems is different, there's got to be a transformation. And you transform the data from the format of one system to the format of another system. And that is a genuine problem that most enterprises, sort of most medium to large enterprises, regularly feature. It's a big problem, and it's not that easy to solve. I'm going to argue that there are two aspects of the transformation. One is that it's a translation, and the second is that the translation is in some way engaging. If you were a simple-minded IT person with reference, now I gather that there are all sorts of stories about semantics. I don't know where Francesco is. Francesco would give you another story, but you need to have some story about how you engage with the world in order to work out what's going on. And if you take reference as being a code word rather than as a specific theory of meaning, then I think that my argument will go through. So if you look at translation, you've got this translation from, in this case, you've got an end-to-end translation. One of the natural things to do, and it's what, if you go back, you remember I talked about Gruber's 1993 paper, it comes up in there, is you have this notion of an interlingua, and the idea of the interlingua is it simplifies the amount of translation. So instead of having to always go spoke to spoke, you go through this hub. So you have a language which you use in the middle, and it's a language which you've used for translation. So that seems to be a natural way to go. And it's theoretically, it seems interesting. You could argue that in some cases where they've got standards for data exchange, it does work, but it's a partial answer, because actually when you run and you get people doing systems, particularly when you get people translating, say, migrating from system to system, there isn't an interlingua for them to use. But let's assume for the moment that you're going down this route. Then the next thing that you do is when you're doing this interlingua, you've got a name X in the source system, you've got a name Y in the target system. How do you work out what your translation is? Now the simple thing is you say, okay, I know that X means this and Y means that, and they mean the same thing. So suddenly you're saying that I want to have the things that I'm referring to, the things that I'm committing to in the real world, and I'm going to use them as my tool to warrant the translation. And this, if you like, it's a theory. I think when you're working on these projects, it's an argument that you practically use. I mean, I've done work on a big installation in Rhineland, and you can have an argument about what a particular asset, where it is. And at the end of the day, you will go out onto the site, you'll walk out on the site, and you'll look for the tag number and check things like that to work out what's going on. So there is definitely some truth in it. How you translate it at scale up to a theory is an interesting issue, and probably part of what we're going to discuss today, but it seems to be the way things work. So the simplest argument would be saying it's plain that first of all, people are having problems interchanging data between systems, so there are problems with interoperability. People are plainly aware that if they could get all of their data such that they could do queries across the various systems, it would make a big benefit. So there is this capability gap, there is this opportunity, and the way in which you need to do in order to make it interoperable, you need a translation. It will simplify things if you have an interlingua, reduce the cost. But in order to get this, to justify the interlingua, there's going to be some need for some triangulation at some point, because in the idea you're talking about the same things in the real world. So it seems like problem solved. So, there's another problem here, which in a sense I'm going to try and answer, and I think someone was asking you, like why are there 3 or 4 top ontologies? Surely, I mean, you just got to do your analysis. There's a proper answer. You'll come up with one. So that's the thing that I'm trying. That's one of the points that I'm trying to explain how this arises today. So there is a thesis, sometimes called ontological relativity, and there's 3 theses of indeterminacy. And the idea is this indeterminacy is resolved by foundational ontology. Quine, well, Francesco was disagreed with me when I chatted to him last night. No, you agree now? Okay. Carnap influenced Quine, but the name is Quine's, and the particular list is Quine's, and people attribute it to Quine. But there is round about sort of the middle or late 20th century, there was this issue where they realized that translation and reference were indeterminate. From an empirical point of view, there's underdetermination. You could do as many scientific experiments as you want, and you couldn't answer some of the questions. Now, some of it might be transient. They have the transient underdetermination in the sense that we haven't worked out what experiment to do, our physical theories aren't quite right. Some of them might be purely metaphysical in a sense, however many experiments you do, it wouldn't turn out. It's kind of difficult. I think I noticed when I was looking through this thing, Quine said, it's kind of tricky because everything's so intertwined, you don't really know what's going on, which is probably a typical Quine answer. But I think there's probably some truth in it. But it doesn't matter. There is this indeterminacy. And certainly for the common sense practical level that we're at, there is plainly indeterminacy. And what you see when you compare the differences between the ontology, even if they're minor, if they say between BFO and Dolce or something, or major, between, say, BORO and either BFO or Dolce, I think what's underlying it is solutions or ways to try and resolve this indeterminacy. I should have got more sleep last night. Okay, so, Peter.
This kind of assumes that you're not going to have lexical gaps, and I mean, we all know in language that there's lexical gaps. I mean, some big differences between one language and another. You can't get, like Schadenfreude or Knockout or something like that. Things that are in one language just can't express it without a complex.
Okay, so what you're saying, I understand what you're saying is that in terms of the expressivity, this can say, let's say you've got a language that talks about meters, you've got a language that talks about feet. It's the reason you can't go between them is, I think, but I'm saying there's something more fundamental in that. Let's say I integrated the language, and so I now had a language that was a joint language, it was a conjunction of them that used all the terms, so I integrate all the European languages. I just keep on integrating the languages. Even after I've done that, I still have this problem of indeterminacy. Yeah. So it's sorry, it's no? Okay. Just this is a summary. So if it is indeterminate, you don't have a single candidate interlingua. I mean, to Peter's term, one of the things you should do to begin with is when you're building your interlingua, if you've got words in one language that you haven't got another and you want to have both, you should get a wider language that has both. So Peter, in a sense, part of what Peter was talking about is this process is a good process, but it's the thing we're saying, even after you've done that, let's say you're God, you do it perfectly, you still haven't got your thing solved. And the problem again is that you've got no unique set of real-world objects to refer to, because depending on the metaphysical choice you make, and also if you think that science is going to provide the answer, a la COVID, we will bow to the science, it's not an option in this case. And the reason that, if you like, metaphysics creeps in is it's dealing with this stuff that the empirical facts can't deal with. If you're a philosopher, there's an enormous literature on this, and it's really, really sophisticated. So, as I said at the beginning, I'm giving a really, really simplified version. If you want references, you can look back at least if you want to see Quine's work, rather than other people look at these, but there's lots of other things that you can look for. Stanford's good, it'll give you the full range of references. I think this is the summary, and I think we've gone through it. Okay. So, in a sense, what we're saying here, if we go back to the picture, we've got this idea of the domain ontology as a link to the world, but it needs to sit, I remember John Collins saying this, does it sit under or over? In this case, it sits over. It probably doesn't sit over, it stands over the domain ontology. And what it does is it resolves the indeterminacy. And so what people are doing is when you're giving you these rules for how you run whatever it is you're going to run, BORO, BFO, Dolce, is they're giving you the rules that rule out the indeterminacy. So then you know what to do. And I think one of the things that, let me see, okay. Yes, so one of the things that's interesting about this is that, of course, if you're a fan of truth, you want there to be one world, one truth, whatever. And there's a bit of a problem. There's this indeterminacy. What do you do? And Aquinas always has an answer. He talks about sectarian or ecumenical responses. I suppose I quite like a general ecumenical response in terms of understanding what's going on, but when you're actually working within your particular thing, which is probably a Carnap, is that I'm sectarian. I just stick with mine while I'm doing it. If you've got a different one, then we get ecumenical when we talk about it. But on a particular job, you will probably want to just say, look, this is the one that I'm working. It does what I'm doing. It seems to be good enough. Yeah. Okay. I have 15 minutes. Am I going to do this? I don't know. Okay. So. If I'm in a sense in the who knows what the community is? In the community of my colleagues Stefano, Giancarlo, and John, and Sal even. I'm an alien. I'm from the IT world, and in the IT world, when they're working with big systems, they have found through bitter experience. One way of talking about it is talking about an architecture. And you make architectural choices and they're trade-offs, they're engineering trade-offs when you make the choices. And what the architecture does is it gives you some framework for doing it. Now, I think you can talk about Kant and various other people in philosophy have got some kind of architecture. And you've got people who talk about systematic views of the world. Lewis, who I'm a great fan of, had a systematic view. But I think there is a more hard-nosed engineering way of talking about architecture. And the way I think about the metaphysical choices are, if you like, the drivers which set up the trade-offs you need to make, and once you've done it, you end up with an architecture. So you've got this way of building an architecture for doing things through going through the metaphysical choices. And that's what I'm going to try and explain now. So in this thing here, is the survey of top-level ontologies. When I did it, I was very unhappy with it. We didn't have enough budget, we were told. We just had to finish it much, much earlier than I'd like to have done. There's a lot more work I'd like to have done. But over time, I've come to realize that it's probably okay, it's probably good. And I don't think there's much else out there on, if you like, the ontology engineering side of the fence. Most of the topics that are in there are topics you cover in your first year undergraduate philosophy, but maybe not in quite the same way. One of the things I tried to do, because this is what you do in IT, is I suppose Kant tried to do it as well. I tried to have my framework. My framework was built up of bits and pieces, which I didn't have quite such nice names. I used horizontal and vertical. I tried to build it up. I think it's not as successful as it should be, but it's good enough. So I had a vertical and horizontal aspects for categorization, and one of the things, and I think this is nice for illustrating metaphysical choice, was something called the horizontal aspects. And the horizontal aspects focused on something that I've called stratification versus unification. So it's where you actually multiply objects or you reduce the number of objects. And each of the choices seems to involve, you look at it, either multiplying objects or so you separate, you have two types of objects, or you unify and you have one type of object. I was trying to find a narrative to explain what it is, and one of the ways you can think about it is a journey where you visit the choices in turn, and you make your choices, and as you do this, you flesh out your architecture, you get rid of indeterminacies by making the choices, and I don't know what's on the next slide, but I think in the slide I've got a kind of a rough visualization about how this happens. I hope someone finds it useful. I can understand maybe if you don't, if it's not your thing. The thing that I'm going to focus on here is something which is being given the locations, and it's about supersubstantivalism. And it's useful again because it links to BORO, because this is one of the choices that BORO makes, that I think to do when you're trying to do your analyses, trying to adopt it can sometimes be slightly counterintuitive. I would argue that in some cases some people intuitively do it, and some people then at other moments they intuitively do the opposite, they separate out. But if you want to do it rigorously, it's good to understand what's going on. And the idea here is that objects have a location, have an exact location, and you've got to ask yourself whether there are two things there. there's me, there's my exact location. Are there one or two things? And if you're a super substantivalist, if you search for it, if you want the literature, there's lots of literature on it, is that what you say is no, there's only one. So can you say that? Okay, so one of the things that I'm not really Gabriele Esciano does mereological harmony. So one of the problems you've got is that, let's say that I decide to have two things: there's me and my location. I've got my hand is part of me. The location of my hand is part of my location. I've got to make sure that they're in the same place, they move around in the same way. I've got to have mereological harmony. What would be really weird is that, let's say that there's me and my hand is part of me, there's my location, there's my hand's location, but my hand's location is not part of my location. It's, I don't know, it's the other side of the room. That's weird. So you have to keep your, as soon as you split up, you have to keep your mereological harmony going. And you get these things like constitution or located in. The relations, when you get a coincidence, if you say they're the same, the relation's identity. If you say they're separate, you've got a relation between them and you need to maintain the relation. Yeah. Is that, am I agree or? No. Go. Okay, all right. You can have a chance later, yeah? Okay, so this is the graphic in the IT world. People like graphics. So the idea is that you're making a series of steps, and each steps you go down here, you make more and more changes. And I think BFO gets the prize for making the most stratifications and making a weird one. Pierre, who was involved in building this work with us for a while, and I kept on asking, why do you have space, time, and space, time, and space, time? And I can't remember what he said, but I was not convinced. Yeah, but so they've got everything. Yeah. In fact, on one of these papers, he's saying, "Yeah, this is good because you've got everything." And I'm not. Yeah, okay, we can talk about it some other time. And I'm sure Pierre can answer for himself. Okay, so one of the things that. Yes. Okay. So this was the example I was talking about. Maybe I should have had me. I've got this choice when I do it. I can make a choice. I can decide there's just objects, which are super substantival, which is just me. There's just one thing here. Or I can have physical objects, me, and my location, which is my exact location where I am. And then I've got this this location. Oh, you can't see, can you? How do I do this? Is it this thing at the top? Okay, well, you can see it there, that light blue line between physical object 1 and location 1, or physical objects and locations, yeah?
What we want is to say that objects, locations, and events are one and the same. So there is a collapse of participation to and partly to the physical generation, the spatial temporal relation to regions.
So I think if I go back, I mean, the short answer is yes, but I think there's something else. So what I think would be really helpful when people think about this is that they're making 6 choices. So I think you've made 2 or 3 choices at the same time there, is the first thing. And I think what happens to partood is secondary. So partood's a follow-on thing. I'm just talking about, I think that exact location, constitution, and those things are the counterpart of identity. Partood comes along as well, but it's a secondary thing. It's not in my story. I'm not saying it's in general. I'm saying in my story, I'm just saying one way of looking at it is every time you multiply coincident objects, you're making a separation, and every time you collapse coincident objects, and that's all I'm talking about. I'm trying to. Everything you say is right, and everything you say, it's really important you understand, but I'm trying to simplify the narrative just to constrain the discussion to some just to make sure, I want to make sure, and maybe in the break people give me feedback that people understand. It took me a while to get my head around the metaphysical choices, because it seems weird. It's like, it must be obvious. There's either one or two. Most of the time, look, are there I don't know, 2 things here or not? Yeah, why? It's sudden, but this is a more subtle and different argument, and that's the bit that I'm trying to do. And what I was trying to do here is say, choice by choice. So you mentioned events. That's another story. That's another choice somewhere down the line. and I want to separate it out. By the time I come to the end of the line, if I go through all my choices, then what you say is true. But I'm trying to separate the journey out into steps for pedagogical reasons. You could tell me I'm making it more complicated. I mean, if you do think so, I'll be interested in the feedback. But I can't. It's too big to take in at one time. You want to see the bits and pieces. You'd have to. I would take some persuading. I'm not saying I wouldn't be persuaded, but I would take some persuading that it's better to join. I mean, you need to join them up at some stage, but for explanatory purposes, I think it's better to break down. And to be honest, if you go to these first year philosophy textbooks, they do break them down step by step. If you look at it, that's the pedagogical technique they use. So it's not. I'm not the only person that's thinking this. So I can't remember whether this is all my own work. Okay, 5 minutes. Let's see. What can I do in 5 minutes? I have no idea. Okay, so either I thought about this and I asked ChatGPT, or ChatGPT suggested it. I can't remember. But this idea is you've got this test. How many things exactly are located in this region? And what you should do is, it's a good test to apply when you're going things. And what happens is that you can get, depending on your choice, you get a difference. So in other words, if you ask the question, you haven't made the choice, you don't know how to answer it. Once you've made the choice, you know how to answer, and you get a numerical difference. So here you see this HM. ChatGPT claimed it was easy to say. I'm not sure quite why I thought that. In your case, you answered this one in this case and two in another. And what's interesting is that it translates into data. So if you, as people sometimes do, is they look at their data structures and they assume that they're a picture of the real world, and they give you an indication of how many things there are. If you assume that's the case in your data, or if you've cleaned your data, you've ontologically cleaned your data, at the end of it, depending on your metaphysical choice, you'll end up with different data structures. Yeah? And if you're trying to integrate data and you don't know what choice is made, and you're trying to do your mapping and you're using reference, and you do a supersubstantival approach on one side and a substantival on the other, and you try and do your mapping, you're going to have problems. I have no idea. Can I just... okay, I'll just... 3 minutes. Okay. Let me do a few more slides, Sal, and then I'll just carry on this and I'll finish it off and we'll go to the next one. So basically in the survey, if you want to know what all the choices are, the survey was a first attempt. It can be improved, I'm sure, of the kind of choices and the way in which the ontology gestures. You get some idea of what the choices are and how the ontologies map. This is the choices we mentioned. What happens at the moment is you've got a cluster on either side, some of which is explainable about dependency between the choices, but not completely. And in fact, one of the things that John and I talk about a lot, what would be really good is we could set up a Cartesian product of all the choices, spot the 10 or 15 that are most likely, and let's see what happens when you run with them. Okay. Are you impressed, Sal? Are you impressed?